Hey everyone, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're pulling back the heavy curtains on a quiet corner of the past. What medieval weddings didn't tell you about the wedding night? No fairy tales here, just a slow, gentle look at the customs, expectations, and whispered traditions that followed the feast and fanfare. From candlelit chambers to awkward rituals, we'll explore the soft, strange world of medieval intimacy, all at a sleepy pace to help you unwind and drift off. So settle in, get cozy, and let history lull you to sleep. Asterisk, the bedding ceremony. Witnesses at the bedside, asterisk, in the soft flicker of torchlight. A crowd gathers at the edge of a bedchamber. The air smells of wine, sweat, and winter smoke. Somewhere nearby, a priest clears his throat, and two matrons of the household fluff the pillows with ceremonial care. At the center of it all stand the newlyweds, stiff, pale, and slightly embarrassed. You might think they were waiting to speak their vows or cut a cake. But no, this is the medieval bedding ceremony, a formal and sometimes public escort to the bedchamber, where marriage was not just a spiritual union, but a physical one, and the whole community had to make sure it really happened. While modern weddings often end in a private honeymoon, in medieval Europe, things ended in public supervision. You weren't truly married until the marriage had been consummated. This was a fact backed by both church and law. A couple might have exchanged vows, shared wine, and danced through the feast, but without consummation, the marriage could still be declared invalid. And so, on that long-awaited night, you didn't close the door behind you. You kept it open, or at least left a witness inside to confirm what followed. The bedding ceremony varied across regions and centuries. In England, France, and much of the Holy Roman Empire, it was a tradition for the community, sometimes just the close family, sometimes the entire village, to accompany the couple to bed. Candles were lit, blessings were whispered, the bed was touched, sprinkled with holy water, and checked for signs of proper arrangement. In noble households, it might involve actual clergy. The priest would say a final prayer over the sheets, asking for fertility, modesty, and divine guidance, but mostly fertility. To us, this sounds deeply awkward, but to medieval society, marriage wasn't a private affair. It was a social contract, with public consequences for lineage, property, peace between rival families, and inheritance law. Especially among nobles, the production of heirs was essential to political stability. Without witnesses, how could a marriage be proven valid? How could an heir's legitimacy be assured? The people involved in the bedding ceremony were often elder women, typically respected matrons or close relatives. These women had the delicate task of supervising without watching. In some cases, they'd simply stay in the room until the couple was settled under the covers, then withdraw slowly, whispering prayers as they went. In other, more serious arrangements, a midwife might stay behind a curtain or screen, claiming she could hear enough to confirm the act. Some accounts even speak of bedding clerks, legal notaries, who took statements the next morning, describing the bedsheets, the noises, or the physical evidence left behind. The church, oddly enough, both supported and condemned this practice. On one hand, the ecclesiastical courts needed proof of consummation to resolve disputes. On the other, the church was also increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of public intimacy. There were many sermons railing against bawdy wedding feasts, and lewd bedding rites. But the custom lingered on, especially in rural and noble circles, where tradition mattered more than ecclesiastical preferences. Nobles took the ritual to almost theatrical extremes. In 15th century Burgundy, there were reports of entire halls cheering as the couple was put to bed in front of a seated audience. Curtains were drawn, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Sometimes songs were sung, jokes were told, shoes were stolen, wine was poured. The idea was not eroticism, quite the opposite. It was to ritualize sex, to tame it, to remove its mystery by wrapping it in fabric and formality. The wedding night was supposed to be awkward. That meant it was being done properly. Ordinary people, of course, didn't always go to such lengths. In small villages, a couple might be followed to their door by neighbors carrying candles, then left alone with some polite cheering. But even in peasant life, there was a strong sense that the community had a right, even a duty, to witness the beginning of a marriage. Children would be expected. Land might change hands. The law might later need evidence. And so, you'd better be sure the night happened, and that someone could vouch for it. Curiously, not all couples were keen on the public aspect. Many pretended to comply, then waited until the house was asleep to consummate in private. Others found ways to fake it. One 14th century case in France tells of a noblewoman who cried out under the covers while her new husband slept beside her, too drunk to move. The next morning, witnesses testified that the marriage was consummated and the inheritance moved forward without delay. In other cases, the lack of bedding ceremony could lead to annulment. Courts were often called upon to determine whether a marriage was real or in name only. If a couple hadn't been witnessed on their wedding night, or if no physical signs were noted by midwives or matrons, the union might be legally questioned. This had huge implications, especially when dowries, land, and alliances were at stake. The church courts, particularly in England and France, spent a shocking amount of time dealing with these issues. Testimonies were taken, bedsheets were examined, witnesses were summoned, sometimes decades after the fact. And while some of this sounds absurd today, it was very real to people then. Inheritance disputes could turn deadly. A missing witness from a wedding night could unravel entire estates. So, what did couples feel in those moments? We'll never truly know. Most voices we have are those of the church or the legal clerks. But one can imagine the nerves, the discomfort, and the strange intimacy of being dressed for bed in front of your community, of lying beside a stranger while the world whispered prayers at your feet. Was it romantic? Probably not, but it was binding in body, in law, and in expectation. And that expectation, it carried more weight than we might assume, because in medieval Europe, failing to perform on your wedding night wasn't just embarrassing. It could be grounds for annulment, or worse, a public accusation of impotence. But what if the groom couldn't perform? What if the wedding night passed in silence, or tears, or confusion? How did society handle failure in the very moment it demanded success? Ask ChatGPT. The wedding feast had ended. The torches had burned low. The last of the guests had staggered home, leaving behind only the chill of the stone walls and the sweet-sour scent of wine. Somewhere in a high-castled bedchamber or a wooden peasant loft, a man lay beside his new wife, unable to move. Whether it was nerves, drink, fear, or something deeper, it didn't matter. morning was coming, and with it, so too would the questions. In medieval Europe, a man's inability to perform on his wedding night wasn't a private shame. It could become a public legal crisis. Impotence, or the accusation of it, was grounds for annulment, and often brought before church courts with surprising regularity. The matter wasn't handled in whispers. It was handled through legal depositions, physical inspections, and detailed questioning, often in front of scribes, priests, and legal witnesses. The church took marriage seriously, not just as a spiritual union, but as a social duty. One of the primary purposes of marriage, according to canon law, was procreation. If the marriage couldn't produce children, or more specifically, if the couple couldn't physically consummate it, then it was considered null in the eyes of God, and the courts treated it that way. If a woman came forward to say that her husband had not fulfilled his duty in the bed, the church could open a formal investigation. What followed was not gentle. The first step was usually a statement from the bride, often delivered with the help of a trusted matron or priest. She would testify that, despite sharing a bed, her husband had not known her as a man should. In response, the man would either deny the claim or attempt to defend himself. If he admitted to difficulty or failed to provide convincing evidence to the contrary, the church could appoint a group of men, often older, respected figures, to examine him physically. These so-called virility tests were not rare. In 1370, for example, a French nobleman named Jean de la Tour was accused by his wife of being unable to consummate the marriage. The church summoned physicians and legal officials to inspect him. The records indicate that his genitalia were examined in a cold church chamber. The examiners noted their size, shape, and responsiveness. The conclusion was written up like a medical report, except that it was used in court to dissolve a marriage. Sometimes the man was asked to perform in front of witnesses, though more often he was locked in a room with his wife and given a fixed period of time, such as 3 nights, to prove his virility. In one infamous case in 15th century Spain, a groom was granted 6 nights to consummate. Each night, a notary stood outside the door. When nothing happened, the marriage was annulled. The man never married again. What if the man refused examination? That alone could be seen as admission of guilt. Church courts were not always kind. The stigma was immense. Impotence was not just a medical issue. It was a spiritual failing, a legal defect, and often a source of mockery. The man might be branded as cursed, bewitched, or simply unmanly. In noble families, this could lead to political ruin. For peasants, it could result in total social isolation. In some rare instances, even accusations of sorcery arose, especially if the failure came on suddenly, and not all claims were honest. Some brides lied often at the request of their families, who wanted the marriage ended for political or economic reasons. If a bride could convincingly claim non-consummation, the entire alliance could be undone. There are several known cases where this strategy was used to prevent an unwanted union from producing heirs, thereby preserving control of dowry lands or titles. One such case emerged in 1423, when a noblewoman in northern Italy sought annulment on the grounds of impotence. Her husband protested, bringing in his personal servants to testify that he had healthy relations with women before the marriage. But she remained firm. After several hearings, a panel ruled in her favor. Rumors later suggested she'd bribed her midwife and forged a medical note, but the marriage had already been dissolved. The land, tied to her dowry, reverted back to her father's estate. These legal cases may sound extraordinary, but they were not rare. In the ecclesiastical archives of Paris, York, Toledo, and other cities, dozens of such records remain. The language is calm and procedural, but the stories behind them speak of humiliation, power, and desperation. What makes them remarkable is how personal failure, something most of us would consider private, was made into an issue of public and legal scrutiny. You might wonder how fair these proceedings were to women. In some ways, they were remarkably progressive. A woman had the right to petition the church if she believed her marriage had not been consummated. She could testify, she could call witnesses, and, in many cases, her word was taken seriously. The church saw her ability to bear children as sacred, and if she were denied that by an impotent husband, it was her right to seek annulment. At the same time, however, these proceedings could be cruel. A woman could also be forced to prove her virginity, either before the wedding or during disputes. If a man claimed she had deceived him, she might face humiliating medical inspections. The logic of the court worked both ways. If sex was the proof of marriage, then everything related to sex was subject to legal investigation. In some societies, like 15th century Spain or certain German principalities, the testing of sexual function became so formalized that a body of bedroom jurisprudence developed. Notaries were trained in writing legal accounts of failed wedding nights. Priests were given manuals to help them navigate cases of bedroom fraud. Midwives became expert witnesses. Even poetry of the period sometimes referenced barren beds and sour sheets as legal metaphors. Thought the psychological toll must have been immense. Imagine a groom waking up on his first morning of married life, not to a kiss or a smile, but to a summons from the local bishop. Imagine standing half-dressed in a cold chapel, trying to defend yourself with no modern understanding of anxiety, dysfunction, or emotional trauma. There was no counseling, no privacy, only the law. Even success didn't always end the matter. In several cases, a groom passed the test, but the wife still claimed she was unsatisfied or remained untouched. The church often erred on the side of caution, preferring to dissolve questionable marriages rather than allow a potentially fraudulent union to stand. After all, the legitimacy of future children was at stake, and with it, the order of inheritance, politics, and property. And yet, these proceedings tell us something deeper about medieval life. They show how seriously the physical body was tied to the moral and legal structure of society. A single night, one moment of human failure, could unravel years of alliance building and economic planning. In a world without modern medicine or private rights, your performance in bed was not your own business. It was everybody's. Still, one wonders, were all these men truly impotent? Or were they simply afraid, unready, or unwilling? Could nervousness have been misread as failure? Could a moment of hesitation have been spun into a career-ending legal defeat? And what about the women? What did they gain or lose by pushing these claims? Were they seeking freedom or survival? Could the legal system, as strange and invasive as it was, have offered one of the few paths to autonomy? By now, you've seen how the bedding ceremony wasn't just a quaint tradition or awkward formality. It was a pivotal moment of surveillance, symbolism, and social control. But what happened after the sheets were finally drawn and the door shut for good? What happened when the watchers left, the wine dried up, and the couple was left to build a life on the foundation of that one night? The bedding ceremony, once performed, left an imprint that lingered over the marriage, whether it succeeded or failed. In successful unions, it marked the true beginning. A man and woman were no longer merely betrothed. They were husband and wife in the eyes of the church, the law, and the community. The night was not just about intimacy, but about legal sealing, especially for noble families whose alliances hinged on bloodlines. From that moment forward, children conceived would be seen as legitimate. Property could pass. Claims could be made. But even in successful cases, the memory of being watched, of being paraded before neighbors, stripped by others, laughed at, prayed over, remained. In peasant households, perhaps these were shrugged off more easily. Among nobles, the story of the wedding night often lived on in court gossip, in poems, and in political circles. For better or worse, it became part of a family's origin myth, a tale that was repeated at feasts and woven into reputation. And if the ceremony failed, the consequences rippled outward. Annulments might follow. Reputations were destroyed. Dowries had to be returned, or, more often, contested. Families could fall into bitter disputes. Feuding over whether a marriage was consummated sometimes went on for years, even decades. Legal records in 14th century France describe a case where two noble families continued to fight over a failed bedding long after both bride and groom had remarried. What made this practice endure, despite its discomfort, was its perceived utility. In societies where literacy was low, where records were few, and where personal honor meant everything, the public nature of the bedding ceremony offered proof. It was a kind of social contract. By witnessing this final rite, the community helped establish a memory that would serve as evidence for future disputes. A neighbor who saw the couple led to bed could be called years later to testify, yes, they were indeed bedded in my presence. This was especially important for women. For many medieval brides, their security and reputation depended on proving they had entered the marriage as virgins and consummated it honestly. If a husband later tried to disown them or deny their children's paternity, the woman's strongest defense might be the memory of those witnesses, the matrons, the midwives, the priest. Without them, she could be cast aside. And so, these moments of public intrusion became strangely protective. The same ritual that violated privacy also safeguarded it after a fashion. For all its discomfort, the bedding ceremony gave women a traceable history. It offered a kind of visibility that could not easily be erased. Of course, not all voices were heard equally. In many regions, especially among the upper classes, the groom's version of events carried more weight. If he denied consummation or accused his wife of deception, the odds were rarely in the woman's favor. This imbalance of power shaped how bedding ceremonies were remembered. A nervous young girl might recall it as traumatic. A triumphant young man might remember it as his formal entry into manhood. In some regions, the practice began to change by the late Middle Ages. In England, by the 16th century, public beddings were becoming less common, especially among the emerging middle class. Modesty had begun to creep into marriage customs. The Reformation also played a role. Protestant leaders viewed some of these rituals, especially the physical witnessing, as distasteful or even pagan. Martin Luther himself, though a former monk, found the concept of open bedding ceremonies unnecessary and encouraged a more private approach. Still, in parts of Germany, Scandinavia, and rural France, the tradition held on well into the 17th century. Some areas transformed the custom into symbolic acts. Instead of actual witnesses standing by the bed, the community might simply light torches and walk the couple to their chamber, stopping at the door. In some places, only the mother of the bride or a godparent was allowed inside. The spirit of the ritual lived on, but the form became gentler. These changes reflected broader shifts in how privacy and intimacy were understood. In earlier centuries, the body was not regarded as a strictly personal domain. It belonged, to some extent, to family, to church, to community. Your body's purity, or its proof of consummation, mattered to others. That's why people watched, touched, and testified. But as ideas of individuality grew stronger, people began to carve out spaces of their own. The wedding night, once a stage for legal theater, began to slip into darkness and privacy. The remnants of these old rituals still exist today. In some modern Eastern European villages, symbolic gestures echo the old bedding rites, such as the ceremonial removal of the bride's veil or the offering of wine to the couple as they retreat. The just married sign, or the couple being showered with petals and led away, reflects a long-standing tradition of public closure and private beginning. Even the act of friends decorating the honeymoon suite, playful, awkward, affectionate, echoes the medieval desire to witness and bless the unknown. What remains remarkable is how seriously the medieval world took that first night. In a time when marriage was as much a contract as a romance, the bedding ceremony was the final signature. It may seem invasive to us now, but for them, it was a kind of truth, an uncomfortable but necessary act of confirmation. One final detail lingers in the record: the so-called wedding sheet. In many areas, especially in Eastern Europe and southern France, the sheet from the wedding night was examined the next day for signs of blood. It was then displayed to family members, or hung from a window. In peasant culture, this was proof of virginity, and therefore honor. A clean sheet, whether from a non-virgin bride or a groom too timid to try, could start rumors that never died. And yet, not all brides bled. Not all grooms were aggressive. Biology didn't always cooperate with expectation, so midwives sometimes staged the evidence. Animal blood was used. Sharp pricks were made in the skin. The performance of purity, or its illusion, mattered more than the reality. In that way, the wedding night wasn't just lived, it was curated like a theater. Peace meant for an audience that hovered just outside the room. Today, we think of weddings as deeply personal. The vows, the kiss, the honeymoon, all private, romantic, sacred to two people. But for centuries, that privacy was hard-won. It had to be invented, over time, by people who slowly insisted that what happens in a marriage bed belongs to no one but the married. And perhaps the strangest part is this: even now, the idea that your marriage is only real if others approve or acknowledge it still lingers, whether through a legal certificate, a ceremony, or the telling of your wedding story. The desire to be seen, to be witnessed, hasn't disappeared. It's just taken new forms. So, the the next time someone asks what medieval weddings were like, you might pause before describing the dresses or feasts. The real answer lies behind the doors that once stayed open too long and in the silence that finally closed them. The Church's quiet obsession with impotence asterisk. You're lying in bed in the year 1257. The room is cold. The hearth is dead. You're young, newly married, and unfortunately not alone. Outside your chamber door, several men and women stand murmuring, waiting for the signal. Among them is a priest, a clerk with ink-stained fingers, 2 midwives, and your father-in-law. None of them are here to bring you breakfast. They're here to investigate your sex life. This was not a scandal. It was a procedure. Welcome to the ecclesiastical impotence trial, one of the strangest and most revealing chapters in medieval marriage history. In the eyes of the medieval church, sex was not just a private matter. It was a legal requirement. Marriages had to be consummated. For them to be valid, a couple who could not have sex, particularly a man who could not perform, could not remain married. The church had to make sure of it, and so bishops and clerks became unexpected bedroom investigators. Not always immediately, of course. It typically began with a complaint. A bride, weeks or months into her marriage, might report to a priest that her husband was unable to consummate the marriage. Sometimes the groom beat her to it, claiming that the wife was resistant or cursed. Whatever the case, the church took such accusations seriously, not because of compassion, but because the sacrament of marriage required fulfillment. The result was a trial. Yes, an actual ecclesiastical court hearing, with witnesses, testimony, sometimes even cross-examination. In 14th century Italy, there are over a dozen preserved cases where church officials investigated couples for alleged impotence or sexual failure. In France, England, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, the process was similar, usually involving both medical and spiritual inquiry. The first step was interrogation. The couple would be questioned separately and together about their physical health, their attempts at intercourse, and any signs of affliction. This questioning could be gentle or brutal, depending on the region and the temperament of the church court. The aim was simple: to determine whether either party was physically incapable of completing the act and whether they had ever tried. Next came the witness phase. Servants, midwives, neighbors, even former lovers could be called to testify. Had they seen evidence of sexual function or dysfunction? Did the man show signs of virility in other settings? Was he aggressive in sport? Did he brag of past conquests? Or was he quiet, passive, sickly? Testimonies were often laced with superstition. A man with a limp might be seen as soft in every sense. A woman who had never bled might be thought to carry a curse. But it didn't end there. Sometimes, and this is the part that feels almost unbelievable, the court would order a physical examination. Midwives were often tasked with inspecting the woman's body for signs of defloration or lack thereof. The man, too, could be examined by older male clerics, or, in stranger cases, physicians paid to report on the size, shape, and function of the member in question. One 13th century French case recorded a physician reporting that the man's member neither rose nor stirred when exposed to a young female servant, a grotesque form of testing used to prove impotence. Another case from England described how 3 midwives declared the bride intact in every way, adding that the husband had admitted he had never succeeded in entering her body. These testimonies were not whispered behind closed doors. They were recorded, transcribed, and read aloud in court. If the case remained inconclusive, some courts allowed what was called a trial of Congress, an attempt to consummate the marriage. Under controlled circumstances, you might imagine dim candles, privacy, discretion. But in reality, this meant the couple was led into a room, sometimes with clerics waiting nearby, and given a set amount of time to perform. A bishop in northern Italy in the 1300s described giving a couple 3 nights in a private chamber with 2 midwives assigned to check the bedclothes each morning. The pressure was immense. If the couple failed, the man could be branded impotent for life, legally barred from remarrying. If the woman was found deceptive, she could be excommunicated. In some cases, couples were divorced on the spot, the marriage declared null, and the families made to return dowries. But it wasn't just physical failure that concerned the church. Spiritual causes were often invoked. Some men were said to be cursed, bewitched by evil women, or struck by God for past sins. The penis, in these tales, was a symbol of not just masculinity, but morality. A man who could not perform was either physically damaged or spiritually tainted. In such cases, priests sometimes attempted remedies. Prayer, fasting, or even exorcism might be prescribed. A 14th century priest in Saxony recorded giving a man a holy relic to wear on his belt, a bone fragment of Saint Benedict, to strengthen his resolve. Another account tells of a man fed bread soaked in holy water for 7 days before another trial was allowed. You may wonder, how could people endure such humiliation? The answer lies in what was at stake. A failed marriage could mean the loss of property, legitimacy of heirs, or social ruin. Women, especially, had everything to lose. If a bride was accused of causing her husband's impotence, perhaps through witchcraft or even bad luck, she could be punished. In some regions, she might be sent back to her family in disgrace. Branded unmarried. In one disturbing case from 1352, a German woman was accused not only of lying about her virginity, but of bringing a curse that withered her husband. The man's family demanded the marriage be annulled. The church agreed. The woman was not only cast out, but forced to pay back her dowry, a debt she could never repay. Yet, despite all this, some couples emerged intact. A surprising number of trials ended with the church declaring the union valid and urging the couple to continue trying. In these cases, the emphasis was less on perfection and more on perseverance. The church, for all its harshness, still saw marriage as sacred, better to encourage fidelity, even awkward fidelity, than release people into scandal. Still, for those unlucky enough to be caught in the gears of ecclesiastical judgment, the experience could be harrowing. Your most private struggles, your body, your fear, your doubts, laid bare before men who had sworn to celibacy. As strange as it sounds, this fixation on impotence reveals a broader truth about medieval life. Your body was not fully yours. It belonged to God, to family, and to the law. Whether you succeeded or failed in bed could shape not only your reputation, but your future. And more disturbingly, others got to decide what your success looked like. But what did people actually believe caused impotence? Was it just physical? Or did the fears run deeper into curses, demons, and poisoned touch. It's a story for another section. By now, you've seen how the medieval church didn't just care whether a marriage looked proper on paper. It demanded proof from the bed itself. But while bishops and clerics drafted rules about bodies and consummation, ordinary people whispered other explanations. In their view, a failed wedding night wasn't just biology gone wrong. It might be a curse, or a punishment, or something darker. In medieval Europe, it was widely believed that impotence could be the result of magic. Folk belief blended easily with church doctrine, even when the church disapproved of it. And in the intimate space between marriage and sex, where shame, hope, and fear all collided, superstition thrived. Some blamed love magic, a kind of spell meant to either encourage lust or completely destroy it. In dozens of court cases between the 12th and 15th centuries, women were accused of binding a man's member or making it vanish through incantations, ointments, or cursed tokens. In one famous case from 1450 in Rouen, France, a groom was reported to have suddenly gone limp at the foot of his marriage bed. When questioned, he said his bride had touched his thigh and whispered something in Latin. Whether she meant to or not, her husband believed he had been undone by that moment. Sometimes it wasn't even the wife who was blamed, but another woman, often from the groom's past. Jealous mistresses, jilted lovers, or witches for hire were popular scapegoats. In regions where herbalism and charm-making were part of village life, midwives and older women were often suspected of meddling with fertility, both to help and to harm. The details in these accusations are strange and vivid. Some claim a wax figure of the groom was melted before the fire. Others speak of toads stuffed with hair, hidden under the bed. In Italian town records from the 14th century, a groom's impotence was blamed on a belt that had been secretly swapped with one cursed by a neighbor. After it was burned, he reportedly recovered his strength. To the medieval mind, these things weren't merely symbolic. Magic was real as illness or cold weather. And when something as vital as consummation failed, people wanted reasons. Rational or not, a story was better than silence. The church tried to walk a careful line. Officially, belief in witchcraft or love charms was discouraged, seen as foolish or heretical. But unofficially, priests often took these claims seriously, especially when faced with desperate couples. In a famous case from Cologne in 1373, a bishop allowed a man to bring in a local priest who specialized in breaking enchantments. The priest prescribed a week of fasting, followed by prayer, while wearing a linen tunic soaked in holy water. Afterward, the man claimed to be cured, and the marriage was allowed to continue, even in England, which was slower to embrace witchcraft trials than continental Europe. The suspicion of magic still crept into marital disputes. A London man in 1391 blamed his wife's aunt for giving him bitter wine on his wedding night. He had not touched his wife since. The aunt denied it, but the fear lingered that sexuality could be manipulated, taken, or destroyed by others. Medicine offered little help. Medieval physicians knew little about what we now call erectile dysfunction. The dominant theory was humoral, the idea that the body was governed by IV fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Imbalances in these humors were blamed for everything, including impotence. A man too cold or too wet Phlegmatic might lack heat, which was believed necessary for erection and fertility. This led to strange prescriptions. One 13th-century Italian physician recommended drinking mulled wine with cinnamon and ginger, followed by a hot bath with rose petals. Another suggested eating roasted onions and fattened goat meat, then lying naked in the sun. The idea was to restore warmth and vitality, to heat the blood. There were also aphrodisiacs, foods believed to spark desire: artichokes, sparrow brains, fresh figs, even powdered stag antlers. In one odd French remedy, the testicles of a freshly killed rooster were boiled in honey and consumed before bed. Whether these worked is doubtful, but the belief in them was real. Anything to warm the blood, stir the spirit, and restore dignity. Yet many cases weren't about physical causes at all, but fear of failure, fear of expectation. In a culture where men were supposed to be dominant, confident, and virile, the pressure to perform was enormous, especially during a public ceremony like a wedding, when guests might joke, taunt, or toast to the couple's success. A young man could find himself terrified. These fears were often called frigidity of the spirit, a kind of spiritual coldness, not in the soul, but in the body's will. Priests counseled men to pray, to fast, to seek God's strength. One even advised a groom to avoid all alcohol and lie silently with his wife on the first night, so the heart may warm before the body stirs. Women, too, suffered from this anxiety. Many young brides were married with little understanding of what was expected, especially among nobility, where marriages were arranged young and the gap in age between husband and wife could be vast. A terrified or withdrawn bride might resist, out of fear, not defiance. Some were punished for it. Others were accused of being cold, unyielding, or, most damning of all, unwilling to fulfill her part. This unwillingness became dangerous. In certain regions, a wife's refusal to consummate the marriage could be used against her in court. A groom could claim she had sabotaged the union. Conversely, if a groom refused, the wife might be blamed for repelling him. It became a tangle of accusation: who failed whom, and who bore the fault. But in rare cases, the truth was simpler and sadder. They just didn't like each other. Not every union was a match of affection. Many were cold pairings made for political gain, family alliance, or economic need. When strangers were told to share a bed, expected to perform before God and family, failure was not surprising. The church did not easily accept this. Love, though praised in poetry and sermons, was not required for marriage. Function was proscent, and so, if two people disliked each other but could still perform the duty, their marriage was valid. But if that dislike took physical form, in avoidance, in silence, in tension, the church had to intervene, and intervene it did. In dozens of documented cases, couples were ordered to try again. Some were even separated for a time, made to fast, confess, and pray for union. In one account from Avignon, a bishop encouraged the couple to sleep apart for a week, then rejoin on the eve of a saint's feast, believing the holy timing might spark success. But success wasn't always possible, and when it failed, the church often had a final tool: annulment on the grounds of hidden defect. If one party was found to have a secret illness, deformity, or spiritual barrier that had been concealed before marriage, the union could be dissolved. This was a dangerous route, often humiliating, but for some, it was the only escape from a shameful impasse. So we're left with a strange picture, a world where sex was public business, where fear met faith at the bedside, and where failure was not just personal, it was political, religious, and social, where curses and chickens and rose-petal baths all tried to fix what was often unfixable, human uncertainty. But what happened when someone was declared permanently impotent? What became of them, and what rights did their partner retain? By now, you understand that in the medieval world, a failed wedding night was never just between the couple. It invited the church, the family, the village, and even superstition into the bed. But when every remedy had failed, when the herbs, prayers, potions, and saints had been called upon, and still the marriage remained unconsummated, something far more serious occurred. The church stepped in formally. This is where one of the strangest corners of medieval canon law comes alive. Trials of impotence. Yes, they were real. Yes, they were public. And yes, they often involved some of the most humiliating and bizarre proceedings ever put to parchment. If a marriage remained unconsummated after some time, usually a year or more, and one spouse wanted out, they could petition for an annulment. To be successful, they had to prove that the other person was incurably impotent. That word, incurable, was important. It had to be permanent, not just temporary due to stress, illness, or emotional resistance. To test this, the church allowed what it called probatio, an examination of the accused's body and abilities. These tests could be either physical or demonstrative, depending on the court, the country, and how brave or desperate the couple was. Let's begin with the least invasive. In many places, like France and the Germanic states, church courts first summoned expert witnesses, physicians, surgeons, and sometimes midwives, to examine the groom or bride. They would inspect genitals for signs of deformity or damage. If a man had suffered from injury, severe curvature, scars from disease, or obvious shrinkage from age or illness, he might be declared impotent, but only if those conditions appeared to be beyond healing. A more unsettling part of this process was what's sometimes referred to as the erection test. In rare and dramatic cases, the man was brought into a private room and asked hafen in front of physicians, clerics, and appointed observers to prove his ability to produce an erection. This was sometimes done with a young woman present, not the wife, known as a tester, who would stimulate him by touch or closeness. The woman wasn't expected to engage in full intercourse, just to create an aroused state that would satisfy the court's expectations. It was humiliating, deeply uncomfortable, and not always effective. Anxiety, shame, cold air, and judgmental observers didn't make for a very helpful setting. In many cases, these tests failed not because the man was truly impotent, but because the conditions were impossible. Yet, once failure was observed, the damage was often permanent. The man's reputation might never recover, and if he passed, the matter didn't always end there. The church still had to be convinced that he could consummate with his wife. Some courts demanded a bed test, which was the most extraordinary of all. The bed test involved the couple being observed while lying in bed together, sometimes naked, or partially clothed, for a designated period, often a full night. A panel of witnesses might include matrons, midwives, or clerics, thankfully watching from a distance or outside the room. They weren't looking for actual intercourse, but signs of warmth, physical affection, and signs of arousal in England. One such case from the early 14th century tells of a noble couple brought into a room furnished with straw and warm sheets. They were given food and wine, then left alone. The next morning, the wife testified that her husband lay still as a brother in the monastery, and that she had never once felt his flesh stir. She was granted an annulment. In some cases, both parties cooperated in this drama, not out of hostility, but mutual agreement. They may have disliked each other, or one may have been suffering silently and wished to end the marriage without shame. These performances then became quiet acts of escape, but often the proceedings were brutal. A wife might be doubted, a husband might be shamed. Rumors would swirl through towns and courts. In a world where masculinity was tied to virility, and femininity was tied to submission and fertility, failure in the bedroom became a permanent mark. Some tried to avoid this route by entering monogamy. If the marriage could be annulled, both parties might retreat into religious life, where celibacy was a virtue rather than a flaw. Others remarried quickly, desperately hoping that the next union would prove their worth. But the scar of impotence, especially if formally declared, could follow a man or woman for life. And yet, interestingly, the Church didn't always treat impotence as a personal sin. It was seen more as a defect, something tragic, perhaps divinely sent, perhaps natural, but not wicked in itself. What was sinful was hiding it, lying about it, or using it to manipulate marriage. Honesty, even about failure, was respected. For women, the experience was often more constrained. A woman could try to annul a marriage on the grounds that her husband was impotent, but she needed more proof than he did. If she couldn't produce witnesses, she often had to undergo her own physical examinations, sometimes by midwives, to prove her virginity remained intact. Imagine the fear of that process, being inspected not for disease or childbirth, but for the shape of a maiden's body. In one Parisian case from 1322, a 19-year-old bride who had never known her husband's touch was forced to undergo such an exam. The midwives declared her unstretched, and the marriage was annulled. She wept in court not because she was leaving him, but because the priest had said her next marriage might be cursed if her virginity were seen as a bad omen. Impotence trials also brought up legal problems. If a man was proven impotent and the marriage annulled, what happened to the dowry, to land, to children, if there were any? In theory, unconsummated marriages had no children. But human nature isn't always that simple. Affairs, mistaken parentage, or secret consummation could complicate everything. Over time, the Church slowly shifted away from these public trials. By the 16th century, Protestant reformers in Germany and England began criticizing the obsession with bedroom performance. Martin Luther himself mocked the idea of bed tests and claimed that Christian marriage should be about companionship, not genital scrutiny. But the traces remained. Even as the Enlightenment dawned and new medical theories emerged, the old belief that a marriage wasn't real until bodies joined remained powerful. Today, it seems impossible. The idea of being brought before a panel to prove your most private self. But for medieval people, it was a matter of honor, truth, and social stability. The wedding night wasn't just a moment, it was a test of legitimacy, and failure echoed far beyond the bedroom walls. So, as you rest now, Consider this. What would it mean to live in a world where your most intimate failure became a matter for court record, where desire was judged, documented, and dissected like a legal case? When the bride was a child asterisk, you may imagine a wedding night as a moment of romantic tension or hopeful intimacy. But in medieval Europe, many wedding beds remained cold, not due to impotence or reluctance, but because the bride was simply too young. In many cases, shockingly, even to some contemporaries, she was still a child. Let us walk gently into one of the most quietly disturbing yet historically common aspects of medieval marriage: the practice of child brides, often betrothed, married, and booked long before they reached what we'd now call adolescence. This was not just accepted, it was expected, especially among the noble and ruling classes. And it wasn't done in secret. It was done under church blessing. So how did a society built around religion, morality, and Christian order come to embrace such arrangements? To begin, we must understand that marriage was not primarily about love or even companionship. It was a contract, often political, always economic. Marriages were used to consolidate land, power, wealth, and peace. If your daughter could marry the son of a neighboring lord, you weren't just creating a family, you were preventing war, ensuring inheritance, or settling a debt. The earlier the contract, the better. Infants were sometimes betrothed in cradles. A lord might visit a newborn girl's bedside and declare, before swaddled witnesses, that she would one day marry his son. These engagements weren't legally binding in the way we'd recognize today, but they set the course of a child's future. Once the girl reached 7 years old, church law allowed her to be legally married, though not consummated. Legal age of consent remained standard throughout much of the medieval period. Canon law, which governed marriage, stated that both parties must be of age to consent to the union. 7 was believed to be the age at which a child could understand the difference between yes and no. In practice, of course, a 7-year-old understood little about contracts, sex, childbirth, or alliance politics, but the law cared more about formal consent than actual comprehension. If a girl was led to the altar, asked if she agreed to marry Lord so-and-so, and nodded, or was told to say yes, that was enough. The church required that the couple consent twice, once at the betrothal, and again at the ceremony. But even this was more symbolic than protective. Daughters were usually brought to the altar under instruction. Few would defy their fathers, especially when so much land or dowry was at stake. So what happened after such a wedding? In most cases, consummation was delayed, at least formally. A girl married at 7, 9, or 10 might live in her husband's household but not share his bed. Instead, she was trained in household management, religious duties, and courtly behavior. She learned to be a lady, a mother, a partner, though she herself was still years away from puberty. Some girls were raised far from their own homes, sent to live with their future in-laws. This was seen as wise. It eased future integration, allowed the girl to adopt her husband's customs, and cemented bonds between the families. But it also meant a child was removed from her parents and raised in a house where she was both guest and future wife. Her identity was shaped by politics, not personal choice. And yet, despite these child unions being normalized, they were not without concern. Medieval writers, theologians, and even physicians warned of the dangers of early consummation. Medical texts noted that a girl's body could be permanently damaged by intercourse or childbirth if she hadn't yet matured. Some doctors advised waiting until at least 12 to 14, when menstruation had begun and the girl was more ripe, in their language. Still, these recommendations were often ignored. Pressure to produce heirs could override caution. Ambitious lords might not wait. The consummation of young brides, though not the norm, was not rare. And once consummated, the marriage was nearly impossible to annul. Perhaps the most famous example of this practice can be found in the marriage of Isabella of Valois, daughter of Charles VI of France. At age 6, she was married to Richard II of England, a man in his late 20s. The union was political, meant to ease tensions between France and England during the 100 Years' War. Contemporary accounts note that Richard treated her kindly and did not attempt consummation. But still, the ceremony was formal, public, and legally binding. When Richard died a few years later, Isabella was widowed by age 10. Her status as Queen Dowager of England gave her a strange power but also limited her future. She would not remarry until her mid-teens, and her second husband died soon after. Her life, like many child brides, was a sequence of titles, crowns, and widows' veils. Another often cited case is that of Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII of England. Married at 12, she became pregnant almost immediately. Her childbirth was difficult, nearly fatal. She never had another child, likely due to internal damage. Her single surviving son would go on to found the Tudor dynasty, but Margaret herself lived the life of a Noon-like widow, ruling through regency and politics rather than a personal household. And still, these stories were not rare. Throughout Europe, noble daughters were currency in a world where bloodlines mattered more than childhoods. To grow up female in the medieval aristocracy was to be prepared for marriage as destiny, a role you would assume long before you understood its meaning. Peasant girls were somewhat safer, not because society valued their consent more, but because their marriages were less tied to politics. They married later, often in their mid to late teens, and usually chose their partners. Still, the age of consent remained low, and early marriage was not unheard of even in villages. And what of the wedding night? Often it was delayed, at least officially. A nobleman might wait years before lying with his bride. But in some cases, particularly when a dowry had changed hands or an heir was urgently needed, patience ran out. There are scattered records in their calm neutrality of girls as young as 9 or 10 becoming pregnant, their bodies breaking under the strain. So why didn't the church intervene? It's a difficult question, because the church sanctioned these unions. Popes blessed them, bishops presided over them. Clergy gave confessions and offered marriage advice. For all its concern with morality, the medieval church never criminalized child marriage. Instead, it operated under the belief that consent was the ultimate virtue, even if that consent came from a child too small to carry her own train. Some clerics did object. Letters survive from abbots and priests who asked whether such unions were godly. But as long as the law was observed and no one raised too loud a protest, the ceremonies went forward. They were celebrated, not hidden. And now, as you lie back and drift among thoughts of stone halls and velvet veils, imagine the silence of those little brides, the ones dressed in fine linen, crowned with flowers, told to smile for lords they barely knew, told to say yes, told to wait, told, perhaps, one day, to lie still. What did they dream of? Did they even understand what they'd become? Once the marriage had been declared and the bride handed over, life did not immediately shift into conjugal bliss, especially when the bride was a child. There began what was sometimes called the waiting period, a strange in-between stage, where a girl was both wife and not yet woman. She had been given away in a church, blessed by clergy, clothed in ceremonial white or fine wool. Her dowry had been paid, contracts signed, but still her life was on hold. This liminal phase, while she waited to be old enough to join her husband's bed, was just as complex as the wedding itself. Let's start with the domestic arrangements. A child bride was often moved into her husband's household, but not always into his chamber. If the husband was much older, as was common, he might live separately or travel often. In noble courts, the bride might live with a chaperone, a governess, an older female relative, or even a retired nursemaid. She would be given her own room or share a women's dormitory with other young noble girls or ladies waiting. In a few well-documented cases, young brides were sent to a convent, temporarily not for religious training, but for refinement. Here, they would learn Latin prayers, embroidery, manners, singing, dancing, and the delicate arts of being a noble wife. It was a finishing school before the finishing touches of womanhood. Many girls entered this stage as young as 8 or 9, remaining in this pre-consummation status for 3 to 5 years. During this time, they were expected to grow physically, emotionally, and socially into their roles, but they were still called wife. They still answered to their husband's name, signed his documents, and were expected to act with the dignity of a lady of the manor. But what, exactly, did society expect of such young wives? Silence, primarily, obedience, grace. They were not expected to voice political opinions or challenge their circumstances. Rather, they were to become ornaments to the estate symbols of their husbands' alliances and their fathers' ambitions. When they walked through town, people bowed. When they sat at feasts, they wore family jewels. But beneath the fine cloth was a growing girl who still, perhaps, missed her mother or her nursemaid's lullabies. There is a curious gentleness in some of the records from this period. Letters from noblemen to their child brides sometimes survive, and a few reveal real affection. A French baron once wrote to his 11-year-old wife, "You are my little dove. When you come of age, I shall make you queen of this house." Another nobleman, returning from a crusade, wrote, "Grow well, sweet girl, and I shall bring you silks from Damascus." These men were not always cruel, okay? Sometimes they waited with genuine patience, even protectiveness, but there is also coldness. Records of dowries and inheritance terms refer to these girls as if they were commodities. Their health, future fertility, and even their weight were discussed in ledgers and contracts. If a child bride became sickly during her waiting period, concern was expressed not for her well-being, but for what it might mean for her childbearing potential. Some families even renegotiated marriage terms if a girl didn't develop as expected. In one notable case from 14th century Castile, a girl of 12 was returned to her father because her hips remained narrow and unsuitable for birth. She was exchanged formally, contractually, for her younger cousin. That cousin was barely 9, yet not all girls were helpless. As they aged into their roles, some became politically savvy, even influential. Anne of Brittany, married at a young age to 2 successive kings of France, learned how to negotiate treaties before she was 16. Catherine de Valois married off to Henry V of England while still a teenager. Later became the grandmother of the Tudor dynasty through a carefully managed remarriage. But even for such prominent figures, there remained that long, silent span of girlhood under surveillance. Everything was about readiness. When would she be ready? How would they know? This question brought us back to the body. In most households, the trigger for consummation was menstruation. Once a girl had begun her cycles, she was considered biologically ready, regardless of her emotional or mental development. Sometimes this was confirmed by family midwives. Other times, it was simply observed through stained sheets or whispers. Among the maids, the start of menstruation was often met not with embarrassment, but with ceremony. It marked the end of the waiting period. It meant the marriage could become fully legal. It meant heirs might soon arrive. In one Italian diary from the 15th century, the mother of a noble girl recorded, "She saw the red flower today. We sent word to her, Lord." A feast followed within weeks. The husband returned from campaign. The couple was given a new chamber, and the real marriageat, least by the standards of the time, began. But some husbands did not wait in royal courts, especially when succession was in question. Pressure mounted to produce an heir as soon as the ink dried on the marriage contract. This meant that some child brides were forced into consummation before puberty, regardless of readiness. The results were often tragic. Medical texts of the time vaguely warn against early childbirth, but their tone is clinical. They speak of girls ruptured or spoiled, but seldom condemn the acts that caused such trauma. Some clerics privately protested, but few publicly intervened, and in the villages where records were scarcer, it is harder to know. But we can imagine the Church's blessing of 7 as the age of consent applied to rich and poor alike. If a landowner married off his daughter at 10, who would stop him? Sometimes the girl did. There are a few rare but astonishing cases of young wives refusing consummation, even in the face of social pressure. A 13th century record from Aragon tells of a girl who locked herself in a closet on her wedding night and refused to emerge until her father promised to let her wait another year. The husband agreed, perhaps more out of embarrassment than kindness. But the girl survived, and a year later, the couple tried again. One wonders how many girls resisted silently, how many simply shut their eyes and did not understand. And so, we find ourselves back in those long corridors of stone castles, among flickering candles and quiet maids. The bride walks in silence. Her train is too long. Her hands are too small for the rings she wears. She smiles because she has been taught to smile, and she waits for the flower, waits for the feast, waits for the knock on the door that means girlhood is ending. But not every knock came gently. The wedding night, once it finally arrived, marked the end of childhood in the most literal way. For some, it came with ceremony and expectation. For others, it arrived quietly and without warning, after a long wait spent in corridors and classrooms, embroidery and etiquette. But however it came, once the marriage was consummated, there was no going back. To be a child bride was one thing. To become a wife in every sense of the word, age 12, 13, 14, was another. In that moment, the role shifted permanently. The girl would now be addressed as a lady, tasked with all the responsibilities that entailed. Her body was expected to carry the future of a house or a dynasty. Her heart was expected to remain quiet, and for many, that expectation turned into pregnancy. Medieval medical texts, many written by male scholars far removed from childbirth, treated pregnancy in young girls as unfortunate but manageable. In reality, the strain on their bodies could be enormous. Pelvic bones too narrow, hormones still maturing, and a lack of nutrition made pregnancy extremely risky for young teens. Still, noble families expected these girls to produce heirs quickly. The maternal mortality rate, though high in general, during the Middle Ages, was even higher for young brides. Labor could last days. Complications were common. Midwives worked without tools we would now consider basic: no antibiotics, no anesthesia, not even reliable forceps. Death in childbirth was so expected that some noble girls wrote wills before giving birth, even if they were only 14 or 15 years old. You may have heard of Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII. She was 12 or 13 when she gave birth. She nearly died. For the rest of her life, she walked with a slight limp and never had another child. And yet, she fulfilled her role in history. Through that painful night, she gave birth to a dynasty. And then there were the girls who didn't survive. Their names are mostly forgotten, their gravestones small, their stories passed over in history books. They were the daughters of barons, squires, or wealthy merchants, married young, made mothers young, buried young. In noble households, a child bride's success was measured in sons, not years. If she bore a male heir, she was praised. If she miscarried or lost a child, it was considered a failure, even a divine judgment. Sometimes, husbands remarried quickly, especially if the girl had grown sick or barren before she was even 20. Marriages, after all, were political tools first. Affection came second. Yet, not all these stories ended in sadness. Some child brides grew into powerful women. Their early entry into adulthood gave them years of experience navigating courts, estates, and politics. By the time they had lived through more than many would in a lifetime. Eleanor of Aquitaine was married at 15, already a duchess. By the time she was 20, she had been Queen of France. Later, she would become Queen of England and mother to kings. Her life was marked by power, diplomacy, and survival, but it began with the quiet obedience of a girl sent to marry a stranger. Some found clever ways to use the system. A few young wives arranged to delay consummation or managed their own estates during their husbands' absences. Others became regents, ruling on behalf of sons who were still in infancy. The world allowed them power, but only after they had proven themselves through marriage and motherhood. There was no room for girlhood unless it was framed in silence. In the villages, meanwhile, child marriage was less frequent, but not unheard of. Economic desperation sometimes led families to marry off daughters early, especially if they could not afford to feed them. A miller's daughter might be promised to a shepherd, the dowry paid in livestock or grain. Their wedding night, unlike in noble courts, would not be written down. But the expectations were the same: obedience, fertility, and silence. The Church, for all its concern with virtue, continued to sanction these marriages, often without question. Marriage, it believed, was better than sin. A married girl, even if she was 10 or 11, was technically protected from fornication. Consummation was allowed as soon as both parties were considered fit, though the exact definition of fit varied widely and was often ignored. Still, not everyone accepted the practice without thought. In late medieval Spain, a group of Franciscan friars began questioning the morality of child marriages. They preached that such unions damaged the soul and harmed the body, and called for the Church to raise the minimum age. Their efforts made little difference, but the voices of protest were there. As centuries passed, attitudes slowly changed. By the 16th and 17th centuries, child marriages became less common among nobles, partly due to rising education and a growing awareness of the health risks. The printing press, too, played a role, as medical texts and moral commentaries spread. More families began to delay marriage, at least for daughters of means, but the legacy remained. Even today, some of the oldest surviving marriage contracts in European archives list ages that seem shocking by modern standards. Brides of 9, 10, 11, 11 tarred into the record, not with scandal, but with celebration. And so we are left with this truth, that history, for all its kings and wars and treaties, is often shaped by the quietest stories, the ones never told aloud. The girl handed off in a church with a veil too long for her height, the girl who bled too soon, the girl who died too young. They didn't lead armies or write books. They didn't rule kingdoms or invent machines. But their lives, measured in contracts, pregnancies, and sometimes silences, held up the entire social structure. Without them, there would have been no heirs, no estates passed on, no treaties sealed in matrimony. They were the living bridges between families, between dynasties, between nations, and so, as you close your eyes and let the stillness of history wash over you, remember those girls. Their footsteps were quiet, their names rarely carved into stone, but in many ways they carried the weight of the world before they even knew how to carry themselves. The marriage debt no one warned them about asterisk in the soft candlelight of a medieval chamber. Behind the carved wooden bed frames and embroidered canopies, there existed a ruler law of both the church and the land that governed what happened between husband and wife. It was rarely spoken of in public, but it defined much of what marriage meant. It was called the marriage debt, and it shaped the quiet nights of thousands of couples. You see, in medieval Europe, marriage wasn't just a union of hearts or families, it was also a contract of physical obligation. Once two people were married, they owed one another a particular kind of service, not emotional, not financial, but bodily. The right to sexual access was built into the very idea of marriage, and it was binding, unescapable, and mutual. The Church spoke of this in solemn Latin, debitum coniugale, the conjugal debt. Canon law taught that each spouse owed their body to the other, just as a servant owed work to a master, and this debt had to be paid whenever it was reasonably asked. So, what did this mean in practice? It meant that if a husband requested sex from his wife, she was not supposed to refuse it, lest she had a religious or medical reason, and the same was true in reverse. If a wife requested it from her husband, he too was expected to comply. Marriage gave each spouse full rights over the other's body. This sounds strange to modern ears, but at the time it was seen as a moral safeguard. The church believed that sexual desire, if left unchecked, led to sin. Marriage, therefore, was a safe channel for desire. Denying a spouse their marital rights was considered dangerous because it might lead them to adultery or lustful thoughts. So even if a couple quarreled, or one was tired, or even sick, the conjugal debt still hovered in the room. It wasn't about affection, it was about obligation. Clerics wrote about this debt in dry, scholarly tones. One famous text, the Decretum Graciani of the 12th century, included long commentaries on when the debt must be paid and when it could be delayed. For instance, during Lent, or when one was on a pilgrimage, the debt could be suspended, but otherwise, the marital bed was open territory. This legal expectation often created a strange dynamic within marriage. Even in relationships where there was little love or where the spouses barely knew each other, the debt was still enforceable. It was one of the few parts of medieval law that placed wives and husbands on relatively equal footing. A wife could, technically, demand her rights just as much as a husband could, but in reality, things were not so balanced socially. A wife's refusal was far more scrutinized than a husband's. Wives who withheld were often blamed for their husband's misbehavior. If a man visited a brothel or strayed with a servant, people would whisper, "His wife must not be fulfilling her duty." The burden of maintaining a husband's chastity, then, fell quietly onto the woman's shoulders. Court records occasionally preserve glimpses of this world. In 14th century London, a woman named Alice brought her husband before an ecclesiastical court, accusing him of abandoning her bed. The husband, in turn, argued that Alice had grown cold and unpleasant and claimed he owed her nothing. The court sided with Alice. She was, after all, still his lawful wife and the debt must be paid. But it wasn't always wives demanding more. In France, a case from the late 13th century tells of a young woman who ran away from her much older husband. She told the court she fled because he was demanding the marriage debt each night without kindness or restraint. The court acknowledged her suffering, but ultimately ordered her to return. She was his wife. Her body was not hers alone. And what of the wedding night, that first moment when the debt became real? For many brides, especially those young or unprepared, the wedding night was terrifying. While some were treated gently, others faced a far more clinical experience. It was, in essence, the first fulfillment of the marital contract. There are quiet references in some noble households to the proving of the marriage, literal inspection of bed sheets for blood to confirm that the bride was a virgin and that consummation had occurred. This practice wasn't universal, but where it existed, it added a public pressure to an intensely private moment. Some families even invited witnesses to wait outside the bedchamber. A nobleman might emerge in the morning, holding up linens like a battle flag, declaring the debt had been paid and the marriage sealed. These customs were not driven by romance. They were about property, legitimacy, and reputation. A consummated marriage was nearly impossible to annul, and without annulment, even an unhappy couple was bound together for better or worse. It's worth noting that while the church emphasized the duty to pay the marriage debt, it also stressed moderation. Excess in the marital bed, too much desire, too frequent indulgence was frowned upon. Sex was not for pleasure, but for procreation and unity. Too much lust, even within marriage, was considered sinful. Thus, married couples were caught in a strange balance, required to engage, yet urged to remain dispassionate. Some couples found harmony within this system. Letters from the late Middle Ages hint at genuine affection, even passion, but others lived under the quiet burden of the debt of duty owed in darkness, in silence, repeated endlessly without joy. Imagine, then, the average medieval couple. They share a roof, a bed, a life. Maybe they love each other. Maybe they don't. But each night, the same rule applies. The debt must be paid. A glance, a touch, a quiet expectation. It was not always violent. Often it was simply dull, repetitive, and resigned. A chore carried out under candlelight, with no one watching but God. And yet, failure to pay the debt could have real consequences. In rare but telling cases, the church annulled marriages on the grounds of non-consummation. If a husband was impotent, or a wife persistently refused, the union could be declared void. But proving these cases was difficult. Courts would summon witnesses, demand intimate testimony, even order medical inspections. One man in 15th century Bologna was required to perform in front of examiners to prove he was capable of fulfilling the debt. He failed. The marriage was annulled. In a world where desire was feared, yet marriage was expected to satisfy it, the marriage debt stood as an uneasy compromise. It was never discussed in poetry, never painted in tapestries, but it hovered between the sheets of every marital bed. A quiet rule written in both canon and custom. And so, beneath the romantic images of medieval marriage roses, veils, vows, there lay a different truth, a truth of obligation, expectation, and resignation. The conjugal debt was not a gesture of love, but a contract of flesh. But what happened when love did appear? What if a couple found affection in this system? Was there room within the cold legal bond for warmth? Or was every touch shadowed by duty? Somewhere between duty and desire, in the dim corners of stone manor rooms and thatched peasant cottages, medieval couples lived out the contract of the marriage debt in their own quiet ways. While the law stated plainly that a husband and wife owed one another their bodies, the daily reality was more complex and deeply human. In noble households, especially, there were expectations not only to satisfy a spouse's demands, but to produce heirs. This added a subtle layer of urgency. A young bride might be expected to fulfill the conjugal debt not once, but many times, until a pregnancy was achieved, with little thought for her comfort or readiness. And if that pregnancy failed, the process began again, with renewed intensity. But not all couples moved to the rhythm of obligation alone. Even within this rigid system, there were whispers of affection, kindness, and understanding. Take the case of Isabel of France, who married Edward II of England in the early 14th century. Their marriage was deeply political, arranged to cement peace between England and France. Edward was known to favor male companions and gave lavish gifts to them, even ignoring his wife at times. And yet, they had children in fact, letters and records show they lived separately at various points, and it's believed their conjugal life was more of a duty than a passion. Still, there are hints that Isabel negotiated her role, slowly claiming influence and asserting her own terms within the marriage. It was these private negotiations never written down, never discussed in public, that made the marriage debt a more fluid concept in some homes. A wife might gently feign illness or retreat behind a veil of piety to delay the debt. A husband, perhaps more fond than forceful, might accept this quietly. They may not have spoken of love, but mutual understanding was its own kind of intimacy. Religion, too, offered a refuge, sometimes, medieval piety, especially in the later Middle Ages, offered married couples a sort of escape clause, temporary abstinence in the name of God. Spouses could mutually agree to set aside the marriage debt for periods of fasting, penance, or pilgrimage. This needed to be mutual. One spouse couldn't simply decide it alone, but it allowed devout couples to reframe their marriage in spiritual terms, at least for a time. Some even used this as a lifelong commitment, known as Josephite marriages. Named after the Virgin Mary and Joseph, these rare unions functioned as chaste companionships. Famous theologians praised such arrangements, though few dared to attempt them, given the risks of social gossip and family pressure. In noble houses, the idea of a marriage without consummation was dangerous. It could lead to annulment, scandal, or the loss of inheritance. But within more ordinary households among merchants, craftsmen, and peasants, the marriage debt was often less enforced and more simply endured. In the countryside, where daily life was ruled by seasons and harvests, sex was woven into the rhythm of survival. Shared beds, limited privacy, and long winters meant that couples were often physically close by necessity. Yet intimacy did not always follow. Many slept together without speaking, rising early for labor in fields or kitchens. For them, the conjugal debt was not legal doctrine, but something simpler, an unspoken rhythm of shared hardship, exhaustion, and, occasionally, comfort. Still, refusal carried consequences. The church courts, which handled marriage matters, saw countless cases of denial, abandonment, and infidelity, often wrapped around the issue of the debt. A wife might complain that her husband had not touched her in months. A husband might accuse his wife of locking her door at night or fleeing to a relative's house. Some even tried to shame one another in public markets, crying out their grievances, while neighbors looked away. In a particularly strange case from 15th century Paris, a woman sued her husband for withholding sex for over a year. His defense: he found her unattractive. The court ruled in the wife's favor, ordering the husband to resume his duties or face annulment. The records do not tell us if he complied, but the ruling speaks volumes. A marriage without sex was considered broken, almost as much as one without children. In response, some wives took matters into their own hands. A few bribed midwives or clerics to testify falsely about consummation. Others sought physical proof that a husband was incapable, sometimes even hiring physicians to examine him in secret. And if a woman could prove that the marriage had never been consummated, she might have it annulled and regain her dowry. But this was rare. Most wives, especially those without money or family support, had no choice but to pay the debt as expected. Men, too, were not entirely free. In an era when masculinity was closely tied to virility, failing to satisfy a wife could bring humiliation. The term impotent husband appeared in legal records as a kind of cursome thing whispered in alleyways or shouted during drunken quarrels. and yet, despite the law's insistence, the reality was often one of quiet tolerance. Older couples, especially those past childbearing age, were quietly excused from the marriage debt. Some slept in separate rooms, others shared space, without sharing intimacy. Among the elderly, companionship began to take the place of duty. The church accepted this so long as it was mutual in monasteries. Meanwhile, monks and nuns studied the marriage debt as a theoretical problem. They debated whether angels understood it, or whether married saints in heaven still owed each other anything. These questions may seem odd now, but they reflected the medieval fascination with rules even in the afterlife. As the 15th century drew to a close, legal and religious writings began to soften slightly. Scholars like Christine de Puzan, one of the few female voices of the time, argued that marriages should be grounded in mutual respect and affection. She urged husbands to treat wives not as property, but as companions. Her words were not law, but they found readers. In quiet ways, the idea of the debt began to shift, not vanish, but shift. And so we arrive at an odd contradiction. The marriage debt was one of the most intimate aspects of medieval life, yet also one of the least personal. It was discussed in courtrooms, debated by clergy, enforced by law. But the real experience of it, that happened in silence, behind doors, between glances, in the hush before sleep, when one spouse reached for the other, and the other chose to respond or not know, chronicle recorded those choices. No scroll preserved those hesitations, but they happened night after night for centuries. Quiet acts of consent, or quiet acts of endurance. Was it love? Was it fear? Was it just obedience? Or something else entirely? In the great halls of royal courts or the smaller chambers of parish priests, the question of a broken marriage was never easy. When the marriage debt went unpaid, whether by refusal, incapacity, or distance, something quietly began to unravel. And though the church held firm that marriage was sacred and indissoluble, reality often demanded exceptions. Let us begin in the courtroom, where the debt became a legal question. If a man or woman could prove that their spouse had never fulfilled the conjugal obligation, the church might grant an annulment. Not a divorce was almost impossible, but a declaration that the marriage had never truly existed, because it was never consummated. This small loophole was one of the only exits from an unhappy union. The process, however, was humiliating. The courts often required deeply personal testimony, medical examinations, or even public demonstrations of a husband's ability. Some men were forced to submit to testing before witnesses, local physicians, priests, or even judges who would observe and report on their sexual function. If a man failed, the marriage could be annulled. A famous case involved impotence, the inability to physically perform mand, could be grounds for annulment if proven, but proving it was difficult and degrading. Men who passed these tests might still be called again, sometimes in front of trusted examiners who were anything but discreet. In a time when masculinity was equated with virility, these proceedings destroyed reputations. Wives were examined too, especially if they claimed their husbands could not perform. Midwives or matrons would inspect their bodies and give statements. One woman in 14th century France submitted to an invasive examination by 3 midwives who attested that she remained a virgin despite years of marriage. It was determined that her husband had never touched her. and the marriage was voided. But such victories came at a cost. Annulment meant scandal. It meant returning to one's family, often in disgrace. For women, it could mean loss of dowry, property, and social standing. For men, it might mean rumors of impotence that never faded. And even for those who stayed married, who endured, who compromised, who continued to share a bed each night, there was no promise of peace. Some tried to flee. Records show women who ran away from their husbands and disappeared into convents or into towns under false names. A few left note-strange, heartfelt confessions scribbled in the margins of prayer books or beneath mattress straw. One woman, whose case was heard in a London court in the 1460s, said her husband had used the marriage debt as punishment, not affection. She left without her shoes, taking only a small coin pouch and her crucifix. She was found months later, living in the household of a distant cousin. Her husband demanded her return. The church agreed. She had no right to flee. The debt still stood. For the very poor, there were no courts, no midwives, and no recorded testimonies. Their negotiations happened by candlelight, in whispered voices, or not at all. The peasant woman whose husband drank too much, the laborer whose wife slept facing the wall each night. These couples, too, lived under the quiet pressure of a rule, never written in their own hand, but known all the same. Fulfilled the debt or face the consequences, not always legal, but social, emotional, silent, and still. Things began to change. By the late 15th century, the Reformation was on the horizon. With it came new ideas about marriage, sex, and individual conscience. Some reformers argued that marriage should be based not just on physical obligation, but on companionship and mutual respect. Martin Luther himself, once a celibate monk, married a former nun and wrote of his wife, not as a debtor, but as a partner. This shift didn't erase the concept of the marriage debt, but it softened it. The idea that husbands and wives might enjoy one another's company, not just share each other's bodies, began to enter the public imagination. Literature reflected this change. In poems, plays, and moral tales, we start to see couples laugh together, argue gently, speak of affection. These were not fantasies, but early sketches of emotional realism, of course. Laws moved slowly. In many places, the marriage debt remained part of canon law until well into the modern period. Even as late as the 18th century, courts would still reference the conjugal obligation in cases of abandonment, neglect, or impotence. The quiet contract, written centuries earlier, still echoed in parchment and judgment. But by then, the meaning had begun to shift in practice. Marriage became gradually more than a transaction. The idea of consent, overshadowed by duty, became more prominent. It was not a revolution, but a slow erosion, a quiet undoing. What does this leave us with? A strange legacy. The marriage debt, though rarely discussed today, shaped centuries of human relationships. It was not just was an assumption, a habit, a shadow cast over the marriage bed. It affected kings and milkmaids alike. It told couples how to behave, when to touch, when to turn away. And for many, it defined the boundary between affection and expectation. Today, we might say that marriage is a partnership, a bond of equals, entered freely. But for hundreds of years, that was not the case. Marriage was a contract with clauses and The conjugal debt was clause number 1. It was not romantic, it was not passionate, but it was real, and even now, one wonders how much of that old thinking remains in quiet expectations, in silence at the end of long days, in the assumptions we inherit but rarely question. Does the idea of owing another person your body truly disappear, or does it merely hide beneath the sheets of time? The linen test how bedsheets proved a virgin bride asterisk, the softest moment of a wedding, the dawn after. When the guests are gone and the torches snuff ties, where this next story begins. But for many medieval couples, the wedding night did not end when the bed curtains were drawn. It continued into morning, when bedsheets became witnesses, and fabric held the power to shame, to vindicate, or to expose in many corners of Europe. Particularly from the 12th century onward, a strange custom followed the consummation of marriage. The display of the blood-stained bedsheet. It was called proof of virginity. A simple, coarse linen cloth, often white or unbleached, would be placed beneath the bride on her wedding night. Come morning, that same sheet might be shown to family members, or worse, to the communities, stained with a red mark that was taken as evidence of virtue. It was a moment steeped in anxiety and pressure, especially for young brides, many of whom were teenagers, or even younger. Where did this custom come from? Not from law, but from social enforcement. In peasant villages and noble courts alike, honor was everything. For nobility, it also secured political alliances and inheritance claims. A spoiled bride could bring scandal, ruin, or the annulment of a marriage contract. And so, on the morning after, it was not uncommon for a midwife, chambermaid, or family matron to inspect the sheet. Sometimes this was done in secret. Other times, especially among nobility, the sheet was paraded, held aloft in front of guests. A clean sheet, or worse, a bloodless one, might ignite rumors, provoke anger. It was believed that a virgin would always bleed after intercourse, due to the breaking of the hymen. We know now that this is not true. Many women do not bleed at all, while others may have irregular physical responses, or have lost the hymen long before through riding, labor, or illness. But in the medieval mindset, without blood could undo everything. Consider a young woman, let us call her Alice, married at 15 to a man twice her age. The marriage is arranged, the feast long, the expectations clear. On their wedding night, she is nervous, possibly in pain. But come morning, the sheet is clean. Her husband, fearing disgrace, accuses her of deceit. Her family denies it. Whispers begin. What happens next? In some communities, she might be examined by a midwife to prove her virginity by sight or touch-in. Unreliable and often humiliating procedure. In others, she might be taken to court. Records from places like Paris, Rouen, and Bologna tell of women who were tried in ecclesiastical courts for failing the linen test. Some were sent back to their families in shame. Others were divorced. A few, tragically, were beaten or even killed by relatives. And yet, there were also cases of forgiveness or even quiet indifference. Not all grooms enforced the custom. Some knew better, others simply didn't care. And a few defended their brides, claiming the sheet test to be unreliable. These quiet acts of defiance rarely made it into official records, but they happened small gestures of human understanding. Within a system built on suspicion, among peasants, The practice varied. In some villages, especially in parts of Germany and Italy, the entire community was invited to celebrate the bedding. This could mean singing outside the couple's room, waiting for sounds of consummation, or inspecting the sheet as a form of communal confirmation. A successful bedding brought honor not only to the bride, but to her father, who had kept her pure. In places like Brittany or parts of England, the ritual was less formal, but still heavy with expectation. The morning after the wedding, the bride might be expected to show her face early modest, but not mournful. A cheerful, healthy appearance was taken as a sign that all had gone well. A withdrawn or anxious bride sparked questions, and if the bedsheets were notably missing from the laundry or the gossip, that silence spoke volumes. This obsession with bedding linens even found its way into dowries and prenuptial negotiations. Some marriage contracts included clauses that required the bride to be a virgin and, if she was found not to be, the dowry could be forfeited. In other words, her body was collateral. If the sheet failed to bear witness, her family might lose land, cattle, or silver. The bride, of course, bore the brunt of this risk. Her father might rage, her mother might scold her for walking too freely in her youth. The idea of consent, whether she had chosen the marriage, whether she had ever agreed to lie with anyone, was never central. It was the stain that mattered, and for those who feared it, tricks and deceptions emerged. But persistent of brides, pricking their fingers to stain the sheet. Some carried a small vial of chicken's blood hidden in the folds of their gown. A few arranged with servants to swap out a sheet altogether. These stories, whether real or folklore, suggest the intense pressure that young women felt and the ingenuity some used to survive. It wasn't always enough. A clean sheet could start a chain of accusations. A stained one, however, was often seen as irrefutable proof even when it was not. The power of that white cloth, hung out to dry or folded into a chest, was more than symbolic. It decided futures, and it lingered. There are cases deep into the 16th century and beyond, where disputes over wedding night linens became central in court cases. Some families even kept stained sheets as proof in inheritance battles, pulled out decades later as evidence that a union had been valid. It's hard to imagine now that a single night, a single moment, a single drop of blood, course of a woman's life so completely, and yet it did. The white sheet, simple, coarse, nothing more than a square of cloth, held the weight of honor, reputation, and truth. It testified in silence, judged without words, and once stained, could never be washed clean in the eyes of the world. But what if the stain was never hers to begin with? What if the entire ritual was built on myth, misunderstanding, and fear? What happened to those women whose sheets were clean and whose futures were decided anyway? Imagine standing in a dark, echoing hall church court, the smell of incense fading into cold stone, and being asked to explain a sheet, not a stolen jewel, not a missing coin, just a linen square, folded with care, but free of the stain that everyone expected. This is the world many medieval women entered the day after their wedding, when the supposed proof of purity failed to appear. While customs varied, the aftermath of a failed linen test often ended up not in whispers, but in court. By the 13th century, the Church had established a robust system of canon law. These laws governed spiritual matters, but also things like marriage, sexual behavior, and annulment. In cases where a husband claimed his wife was not a virgin or where a marriage was unconsummated, ecclesiastical courts were called upon to intervene. They did not move quickly nor kindly. Take, for example, a case recorded in the archives of Rouen in the 14th century. A knight, Geoffrey de Saint Martin, accused his young wife Jezebel of deceit after their wedding night. He stated plainly that the sheet was clean, her body bore signs of previous use, and that he had been dishonored. Jezebel, brought before a panel of clerics, denied it all. She claimed pain, bleeding, delayed. She mentioned rough handling and her fear. The court sent her to a panel of midwives for examination. The result? Inconclusive. No definite signs of virginity remained. And so, the judges deferred to the sheet. A servant testified the linen bore no sign of red. The court sided with Geoffrey. The marriage was annulled. Jezebel was sent back to her father, who was required to return part of the dowry. No one asked her again what she remembered of that night. These courts were often guided by conflicting principles: compassion, reputation, doctrine, and superstition. One judge might argue that virginity could not always be measured. Another might insist the blood was essential proof. Either way, the woman rarely spoke uninterrupted, and almost never believed. Many reasons why a woman might not bleed: health, age, activity, even diet. Some brides had already begun menstruating. Others had experienced minor internal injuries from labor or farming work. And of course, some women were simply born without a complete hymen at all. But the Church, bound to symbolic interpretation, often saw bleeding as the physical sign of a spiritual truth. The sheet became not just a physical object, but a test of the soul. This burden wasn't only felt by nobility. Among peasants, cases were handled in manorial courts, often presided over by local lords or stewards. These were rougher, less formal, but sometimes more brutal. Accusations of false maidens appear in parish rolls and village records across England, France, and the Low Countries. One entry from 1374. In a Wiltshire manor, book notes, Agnes of the Mill was returned to her father after no mark was seen on the linen cloth. Her man did strike her and refused to dwell with her. In this simple line is a life changed. Agnes, likely no older than 16, was shamed publicly, beaten privately, and cast back into her childhood home where she might be seen as a burden or even a curse. Her father's reputation would be whispered about in the alehouse. Her younger sisters might struggle to marry. A chain reaction caused by one clean sheet, yet the system was full of contradictions. In some places, failure to produce a blood-stained sheet was not seen as final. Communities where midwives and matrons had more authority might overrule a husband's complaint. Women banded together. One 15th century account from Bavaria tells of a bride whose mother, sisters, and cousin testified together that the blood had stained her nightgown instead. The court accepted this, and in certain regions, especially parts of southern Italy and Spain, bride chests included pre-prepared sheets marked subtly with blood ahead of time, just in case. These were whispered strategies passed from mother to daughter, folk wisdom, not rebellion, but survival. Still, many women had no defense. In towns where virginity was treated as property, a failed test could undo even well-made alliances. In a court record from Venice, a merchant annulled A marriage contract, after claiming the bride, was not new to man, though he admitted he loved her. The stain was missing. The marriage was undone. His regret was written plainly in his letters, but he still proceeded. Such was the power of public shame. This shame was deeply gendered. While women were judged on whether they bled, men were rarely required to prove anything. A groom's past his lovers, his illegitimate children, was considered normal, even expected. He was not required to show a sheet or explain away a silent night. And so the linen test became a one-sided tribunal, where women were judged for their bodies, their biology, and their silence. The stain, real or false, spoke louder than testimony. And once a woman failed the test, her future narrowed. Remarriage became harder. Dowries were returned or refused altogether. Some were forced into convents. Others were taken back by fathers and brothers who saw them not as daughters, but as broken contracts. Yet there were rare glimmers of resistance. Some women refused to be examined. Others challenged the assumptions. In a Catalan case from 1482, a woman named Maria declared publicly that she would not allow any midwife to touch her, calling the examination an insult before God. Her husband, ashamed of the scene, withdrew his complaint. Their marriage continued, but the story became legend in their village, passed down in hushed tones. What strikes us now is how ordinary the linen test became, a routine, a ritual, a tradition, soaked in fear, where silence became survival and compliance was mistaken for truth. And yet, not everyone complied. Some protested, some lied, some escaped, but most simply endured, and in the folds of those long-lost sheets, worn thin by time, forgotten in chests, or burned with scandalar, countless stories like these. Stories of women judged without trial, of innocence measured in blood, of futures decided in the quiet hush of dawn, when only the linen bore witness. As the sun rose and candles burned down, the bride would sit alone, waiting to see whether her body had spoken loudly enough, waiting to find out if the cloth would condemn her. And always, beneath that waiting, the same unspoken question lingered. What if the sheet tells the wrong story? Long after the wedding guests had gone and the hearths were cold, the white linen remained. It was rarely spoken of, once folded away, and yet it shaped reputations, determined marriages, and settled disputes. The tradition of the stained bedsheet may seem strange to modern ears, but it held on for far longer than most would expect by the dawn of the Renaissance. You might assume such rituals, so rooted in superstition and misunderstanding, would fade away. Science was stirring. Human anatomy was slowly being studied with more seriousness. But in the world of marriage customs, change came slowly, and often not at all. Even as the printing press spread knowledge and scholars debated the nature of the soul, the sheet retained its grim authority. In 16th century France, noble households still performed the public bedding ritual. The marriage was not considered fully valid until consummation, and the evidence was still expected if not paraded, then at least confirmed. Servants and family members remained present during the preparations. In some households, a discreet housemaid was sent in the next morning to inspect the linens. A mark of blood brought quiet satisfaction. A missing mark brought shame, suspicion, or endless discussion behind closed doors. This obsession with a single stain began to take on a deeper legal meaning. In places like Hungary, parts of Poland and certain German territories, the stained sheet was not just symbolic, it became a legal document of sorts. In disputes over inheritance or annulment, it could be presented in court. Families stored them in dowry chests, carefully folded, and sometimes even marked with stitching to denote the bride's name and the date of her wedding. In one unusual case from Augsburg, a woman's inheritance was successfully defended in court using a bedsheet from 40 years earlier. The linen, fragile but intact, bore faded marks that her family claimed were from her wedding night. The opposing party scoffed, but the judge accepted it. The past, it seemed, could still bleed into the present, but not all communities clung to the tradition equally. In Protestant regions during the Reformation, views began to shift, with less emphasis on sacraments and more on private conscience. The idea of policing virginity with cloth began to seem distasteful to some. In certain Calvinist towns in Switzerland and the Netherlands, pastors preached that chastity was a matter of the soul, not the bed. Still, old habits persisted. Some families continued the custom in secret, even as public rituals faded. In rural Catholic areas, especially in Sicily, southern Spain, and the Balkans, the tradition not only became more theatrical. By the 17th century, it was common in some villages for the stained sheet to be publicly displayed on a clothesline or across the bride's family balcony. In parts of Albania, such displays were attended by drums and horns, with food and drink served beneath the fluttering cloth. It was a festival of proof. For the bride, however, it was rarely celebratory. Even when she had passed the test, the message was clear. Her worth had been confirmed by blood, and once that ritual was complete, she passed from the control of her father to the ownership of her husband. Her chastity was no longer hers. It had been validated, transferred, and spent. But what of those who did not bleed? As understanding of female anatomy slowly grew, a few voices began to question the wisdom of the linen test. In 1671, a French physician named Jean Rylon published an essay noting that not all virgins bleed, and not all bleeding indicates virginity. His words were ignored by most, but the seed was planted. Over the next century, more physicians quietly agreed, though none could offer a replacement proof that satisfied public hunger for certainty. So the linen remained, even into the 19th century. Especially in rural Europe, the sheet was still shown, still checked, still whispered about. In some regions, failure to produce a stained sheet was grounds for annulment. Even as the Enlightenment swept across courts and classrooms, knowledge advanced, but custom lagged behind. What lingers, perhaps most painfully, are the quiet, personal consequences. For every story of scandal, there were many more stories of quiet grief. Young brides who failed the test and were cast aside, women who never remarried, girls who bled and still were not believed, husbands who doubted, brothers who raged, and midwives who were forced to offer opinions based on nothing more than thread and stain. In some families, the failure of a wedding night sheet led to generational bitterness. A younger daughter might be sent to a convent to cleanse the family name. A father might lose a land agreement. A mother might be shamed for raising her girl too freely. And through it all, the bride, silent, judged, and rarely heard, bore the shame alone. Yet despite its cruel power, the tradition was fragile. Sheets rot, blood fades, memory alters, and in time the practice died a quiet death. By the early 20th century, the linen test had largely vanished from most of Europe, replaced by more private understandings of marriage and trust. But echoes remain, even today. In some parts of the world, women are asked to prove their virginity. Rituals vary. Some involve cloth, some involve invasive medical tests, others rely on reputation alone. The linen has changed form, but the need to prove remains. And so, the medieval bedsheet, yellowed by time and stiff with starch, has become a symbol not of purity, but of pressure, a pressure that lingered in every stitch, that waited on every morning after that, judged without trial and testified without speech. And somewhere, in a chest long since sealed and tucked away in an attic, or buried beneath dust in a church archive, a folded square of linen still sleeps it, stains faded to nothing, its purpose forgotten, its weight not because, for centuries, a piece of cloth held power over a life. It told a story, but not always the truth.